Trees in urban environments provide many environmental, economic, and social benefits to people and communities, but trees can also pose risks. Many communities make an effort to manage trees to maximize the benefits they provide while minimizing the risks that they pose. Today we're going to take a look at tree defects, that is, conditions that can affect the structural integrity of trees and increase tree-related risk. Trees in cities often grow in tough environments with poor soils, pollution, heat and drought stress, or other stressful conditions. Trees that are under severe stress, that are poorly structured or improperly maintained, tend to be less healthy and can have more defects of greater severity. If severe enough, tree defects can increase risk in the urban landscape, such as when trees drop branches, break, or topple over, typically during storm events. On the other hand, trees that are growing in healthier environments, that are well structured and properly cared for, are going to have fewer, less severe defects. This means that trees are also going to be healthier and live longer. Taking good care of our trees is imperative to the safety, health, and welfare of our communities. But in order to care for trees properly, we need to learn to recognize defects that could threaten trees' structural integrity, their health, and their longevity. Today we will discuss several common types of tree defects, including leaning trees, trees with buried trunk flare, codominant stems and included bark, decay cavities, girdling roots, deadwood, and cracks and splits. Here's an example of a healthy, well-structured tree. It has a single trunk. It has evenly spaced branches that are well proportioned. The tree has good taper, meaning that it widens as it gets toward the bottom. It has a good trunk flare, that is the area where the trunk transitions into the root system, and the roots appear to radiate normally and naturally outward away from the trunk. You might also notice that the trunk has a slight lean to it. However, not all trees that lean are problematic. In this particular case, the tree is growing naturally at an angle. This is okay because as the tree grows, it compensates for the additional stress of the lean by adding wood where it needs to support itself. The lean is of very little consequence to the overall health and structural integrity of the tree, and I would say that this tree poses very little risk. There are times, however, when a leaning tree may be a concern. Trees that are leaning at steep angles and show exposed or broken roots on the backside of the lean, or trees where the earth appears to be heaving or lifting on the backside of a lean near the trunk, may have experienced some degree of root damage or disturbance. Trees that were previously vertical but have listed to a leaning position immediately following a storm are perhaps the most concerning. However, it can be difficult for the untrained eye to accurately assess when a leaning tree is a problem. This is why it is important to have an ISA certified arborist assess your trees for health and structural issues. This tree has another defect, a decay cavity here. The cavity appears recessed in the trunk because of the amount of new growth that has occurred since the time of the injury, suggesting that it happened a long time ago. Because of the tree's health and the amount of new growth that has occurred since the time of the injury, it's safe to say that this tree has successfully compensated for what would otherwise be considered a structural weakness. This tree will continue to grow and thrive and be healthy in spite of its defect. This tree here has several defects that we're going to look at today. The most obvious one, of course, is this extremely large decay column that pretty much runs the length of the entire trunk. Decay in trees can take place anytime that fungal organisms can get inside the tree. This usually happens when there's some kind of a mechanical injury that removes bark on the tree. Tree bark provides a protective function for the tree, and once the bark is removed, then it can be rendered vulnerable to pests, diseases, and other pathogens. My guess, in this case, is that there was once another large stem here, maybe even with included bark, that eventually peeled off in a storm event, leaving this large wound behind. It's tough to say exactly when that might have happened, but as a result of all the new growth that's occurred since the time of the injury, we can guess that it probably happened decades ago. It's this new growth that has occurred since the time of the injury that it's given the tree the additional structural support that it needs to remain standing today. This example illustrates an important point to be made about trees. Trees do not heal from their injuries as we do. Healing implies that the damaged tissues will regenerate and repair themselves in response to the injury, such as our skin does if we cut ourselves. However, trees don't have this capacity to heal. They can, however, do two things in response to injury. The first thing that they can do is to restrict or slow the rate of decay by erecting biochemical barriers within the surrounding wood fibers near the injury. The second thing they can do is to grow new wood around the point of the injury in an effort to try to strengthen the tree at the point of weakness. This will seal in the decay and prevent other decay organisms from coming into the tree. The important thing to remember is that trees don't heal, they seal. So we know that the tree is still standing today, but overall, this tree isn't terribly healthy. If this were your tree, I would suggest that you hire an ISA certified arborist to inspect it and offer recommendations. In cases where decay is particularly extensive, or if the tree is not healthy enough to successfully fend off decay or grow new wood to strengthen itself, then removal of the tree may be the most prudent option. However, if we have an interest in keeping this tree in the landscape, there may be other options, such as pruning for example, that could be administered to the tree in order to try to keep it. The trunk flare is an extremely important part of the tree. This is where the trunk flares out at the bottom and transitions into the root system. At this location we see the development of what are called buttress roots. They're called that because not unlike the buttresses that hold up the Notre Dame Cathedral, these roots are providing a lot of mechanical support for the entire above ground portion of the tree. You'll notice that the birch tree behind me has no visible trunk flare, suggesting that it's actually buried below grade. This is a point of concern. Areas where the trunk flare has been buried can lead to decay in the future, and having a buried trunk flare can also obscure root defects and other tree problems. We can avoid this problem at the time of planting by making sure that the root flare is visible and appropriately located at the grade of the soil. A little extra effort at the time of planting goes a long way for ensuring the future health of your tree. For trees that are established in the landscape and have a buried trunk flare, it can be very difficult to correct that situation. In some cases, soil can be carefully excavated and removed and pulled away from the trunk of the tree, but this isn't always possible. Here's an example of what we call codominant stems. These two stems are said to be codominant because they're approximately the same diameter once they split away from the trunk. Codominant stems by themselves aren't necessarily a problem, but when they're characterized by such a narrow angle of attachment to the main trunk, that can lead to a defect that's called included bark. Included bark is the bark on the inside of each of the two stems. Consider that every year the tree adds a new growth ring, meaning that each of the two stems adds a new growth ring. As each tree adds a new growth ring every single year, the stems get closer and closer and closer together until they eventually make contact. At that point, the bark becomes included between the two stems where we can no longer see it, hence the name included bark. The issue with included bark branch unions is that each of the two stems will continue to grow even after they've made contact with one another. As each stem adds a new growth ring every year, more and more pressure builds up between those two stems. As that pressure mounts, it puts additional strain on surrounding wood fibers that are supporting the branch union. When the pressure between these two stems becomes severe enough because of the included bark union, or if any decay that sets in becomes extensive enough, one side of the tree or the other could completely cleave off, leaving a jagged wound on the remaining portion of the trunk. Included bark isn't just exclusive to codominant stems. Included bark can also occur between stems and smaller branches that are attached to them. Anytime you see included bark, either between codominant stems or between a stem and a smaller branch, this is a red flag. The tree could be fine, but it could also be a sign that there are bigger problems happening beneath the bark. Another common defect that is illustrated by this tree, as well as many other trees, is deadwood. Deadwood's extremely common in trees because all trees will naturally shed limbs on a periodic basis. However, if your tree is producing a lot of dead branches, and especially a lot of dead branches of much larger size than this one here, that may be a bigger concern, and may be a sign of more serious tree health problems. Having your trees pruned periodically, every 3 to 5 years or so, can ensure that deadwood gets removed before it becomes unstable and drops out of the tree. Another common defect illustrated by this tree is called a girdling root. Ideally, tree roots come from the buttress and radiate out normally away from the trunk. A girdling root, however, is misoriented and grows perpendicular to the trunk. When a root or several roots are wrapped around the base of the trunk like this, it can have the same effect as included bark, whereby both the root and the trunk continue to grow even after they've made contact with one another. What's particularly problematic about girdling roots, however, is that the pressure that builds up down here can pinch off the tree's plumbing system and restrict the flow of water and nutrients coming from the root system up into the remainder of the tree. Severe girdling root problems that cause dieback in the trunk tissues can render the tree vulnerable to completely toppling over in a storm. Girdling roots can be corrected at the time of planting, and should be, because once the tree is established in the landscape, they're extremely difficult to correct or remove. Some trees can live for decades with minor girdling root issues. However, if girdling roots are particularly large or particularly numerous, they can completely strangle the tree and slowly kill it. Any discussion about common tree defects would not be complete without mentioning cracks and splits that can occur in trees. Cracks and splits are often associated with events that apply tremendous force to trees, such as loading from excessive wind, snow, rain, or ice, or from collisions, such as if a tree is struck by a moving vehicle or another nearby tree falling onto it or into it during a storm. However, cracks can also occur at unions between leaders and branches that have included bark. In this example, there is a severe crack that originates from an included bark branch union between codominant stems. Given the severity of this crack and the tree's proximity to the nearby bike trail, this tree was deemed to pose an extremely high risk and has already been removed. So, even if your tree has a defect of some kind, that doesn't necessarily mean that your tree is dangerous or hazardous. In fact, many trees can be quite strong and quite healthy in spite of their defects. If you aren't sure as to whether or not your tree is healthy, it's recommended that you contact an arborist that is professionally certified by the International Society of Arboriculture. This presentation has been brought to you by the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, the USDA Forest Service, and the City of Tukwila. For more information about proper tree care, or to locate an ISA-certified arborist near you, please visit www.treesaregood.com.